My daughter, Clara, looked me dead in the eye, the holiday lights sparkling behind her like mocking stars. She said, "The greatest gift you can give us this Christmas, Mother, is to stop being a freeloader and disappear from our lives." In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. A silence fell over the room that felt heavier than the weight of my 70 years. I simply packed my few things, closed the door to the house I thought was still my home. Before we continue, check if you are subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. And stepped out into the biting cold. But what I did the next day was the only honest action I had taken in nearly a decade. The greatest Christmas gift you could give us is to stop being a freeloader and disappear from our lives. Clara's words weren't a plea. They were a sentence delivered with cold, surgical precision. I stood there, right in the entryway of what used to be my husband's and my own dining room, clutching the small bag of wrapped presents I'd bought with the last $200 of my modest monthly pension check. I watched Clara's face, usually so composed, twist into a mask of pure, undisguised contempt as she looked at me. The entire family was present for the execution. My son-in-law, Richard, a towering man with a perpetually dismissive air, sat at the head of the mahogany table, exactly where my late husband, Arthur, used to sit. He didn't even bother to look up from carving the expensive prime rib. My two teenage grandchildren, Olivia, who was 17, and Thomas, 15, kept their eyes glued to their expensive new smartphones. Their calculated silence was somehow more agonizing than Clara's brutality. Even my younger sister, Diana, who I had driven 4 hours round trip to pick up for the evening, just stared intently at her crystal water glass. She wouldn't meet my gaze. "Clara, please," I whispered, my voice cracked and barely audible above the sudden, high-pitched ringing in my ears. "It's Christmas." She let out a brittle, sharp laugh, a sound that used to fill me with such warmth when she was a little girl playing under the tree. Now it felt like splintered wood in my chest. "Christmas," she echoed. "You mean the holiday where you show up empty-handed, Mother? Expecting us to feed you and cater to you like you're some kind of honored guest instead of the permanent, suffocating burden you've become." I scanned the room desperately, searching for even one flicker of human sympathy. Olivia, my granddaughter, glanced up briefly, her expression fleetingly sad. But the moment her mother shot her a sharp, warning look, she quickly returned to her phone, her thumb scrolling frantically. Thomas, my grandson, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. "I brought gifts," I said weakly, holding up the small, pathetic bag. The contents: a hand-knitted shawl for Clara, a rare used book for Richard, small trinkets I'd carefully selected from yard sales because my monthly check barely covered the cost of my tiny storage unit, and essential groceries. Suddenly felt utterly humiliating. "Oh, marvelous," Richard finally spoke, his voice heavy with mocking resignation. "More clutter from the bargain bin. Just what we needed to cram into our already overcrowded, carefully curated home." Clara rose slowly from her seat. Her silk designer dress, a garment that probably cost more than I spent on food in 6 months, shimmered under the chandelier. "Mother, look around," she commanded, sweeping her hand across the opulent room. "This house, this life, the stability we've built, we did it without you. We don't need your charity gifts. And we absolutely do not need you treating our life like your personal all-inclusive resort. We're done subsidizing your choices." The room began to spin subtly. I gripped the heavy wooden door frame to steady myself. "This was my house. All your father and I worked for." She cut me off, her voice like a whip. "Past tense, Mother. Daddy's been gone for nearly 10 years, and you've been leeching off everyone's good nature ever since. Richard and I are trying to build a reputable future here. And frankly, having a dependent, unemployed mother perpetually hanging around is an embarrassment." Each word was chosen not just to hurt, but to obliterate. I could see the cold, calculating satisfaction in her eyes, the pleasure of finally saying aloud the contempt she had clearly been nursing for years. "When did my little girl," I managed to say, thinking of the child who used to hide in my skirts, the one who used to cry if I left the room, become this vicious stranger? "I helped raise your children," I pleaded, my voice beginning to tremble. "When you went back to work after Thomas was born, who watched them every day? Who drove them to all their activities? You didn't have anywhere else to go." Richard interjected loudly. "Don't act like you were doing us favors. You were desperate for a place to stay or at least a warm meal. Diana, my sister, finally lifted her head slightly. Maybe we should all just calm down. No, Clara roared, silencing her aunt instantly. I am tired of this charade. Mother, you have been a weight around our necks for years. You contribute absolutely nothing except guilt and obligation. Even your own sister doesn't want to deal with you anymore, does she, Aunt Diana? I turned toward Diana, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces as she quickly avoided my eyes, returning her attention to her plate. We had been inseparable once, before her husband made his fortune and they moved to the wealthy West Coast suburbs, before I became the poor, grieving sister who constantly needed help. I think, Diana said, her voice careful and tightly controlled, maybe some space would genuinely be good for everyone. That was the absolute end. Not just of this hideous dinner but of everything. 10 years of clinging to the belief that I still had a family. 10 years of convincing myself I was helping, of thinking that even if my money was gone, at least I wasn't utterly alone. You want me to disappear? I asked, my voice suddenly steady, a strange, terrifying coldness settling deep in my chest. Fine. I turned and walked to the small guest room where I had been staying for the past 6 months, ever since the owner of my storage unit converted the floor into office space, making my temporary living arrangement untenable. Behind me, I could hear them instantly resuming their dinner conversation, as if the moment had been a minor inconvenience. Richard talking about a lucrative new business venture. Olivia asking if she could spend New Year's in Aspen with friends. Normal, beautiful family chatter that no longer included me. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out my old, worn suitcase, the same suitcase Arthur and I had used on our honeymoon 45 years ago. I folded my few belongings carefully. 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, some undergarments and thick sweaters. The photos of Clara as a baby, her first steps, her college graduation. Should I take them? Did they even hold any meaning when the child in those pictures had grown up to hate me so intensely? Grandma! I turned sharply to find Thomas standing quietly in the doorway. At 15, he was already taller than Richard, with my late husband Arthur's gentle, curious eyes. For a hopeful, desperate moment, a light flickered in my chest. Are you really leaving? He asked, his voice low and quiet. I nodded, unable to speak, afraid my voice would betray the earthquake happening inside me. He hesitated, glancing back toward the dining room where the sounds of his parents' conversation continued, muffled and indifferent. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his eyes wide and sad. Then quickly he disappeared. That small, genuine act of kindness almost broke me. Almost. But something inside me had fractured and reformed during Clara's venomous speech. A sudden crystalline clarity I hadn't felt since Arthur's death was descending, sharp and cold as the winter air outside. I zipped up the heavy suitcase, walked back through the lavish living room, and found them still at the table, now picking at the expensive dessert. Beautiful people in a beautiful hollow house, playing at being a beautiful family. I will be out of your way, I said calmly. Clara looked up, expecting the tears, expecting the begging. When she saw neither, a flicker of something was its surprise. Disappointment crossed her face. Good, she said, but her voice sounded noticeably less certain now. I set my house key on the gleaming marble coffee table. The same table where Clara used to do her homework while I cooked dinner in the kitchen that was no longer mine. The same table where she had planned her wedding while I offered suggestions that were politely, coldly ignored. Goodbye, I said simply. And then I walked out into the December night, closing the heavy oak door quietly behind me. No dramatic slamming, no theatrical exit, just a soft, almost inaudible click that seemed to echo through the emptiness in my chest. As I loaded my suitcase into my 25-year-old rusty sedan car, Arthur had meticulously cared for. I could see them through the large dining room window. They had already returned to their dessert and their conversation, their laughter carrying across the manicured lawn like a cruel, sustained mockery. I sat in the car for a long moment, the engine running, the warm air slowly beginning to clear the fog from the windshield. 10 years of this. 10 years of believing I was family when I was really just an inconvenience they had finally, decisively decided to shed. But as I pulled away from the house where I had once been welcomed, where I had once belonged, I felt something entirely unexpected. It wasn't just the pain of rejection. It was relief. Whatever came next, wherever I went, I wouldn't have to pretend anymore that I was wanted where I clearly was not. I wouldn't have to smile through another tense dinner where my very presence was tolerated rather than cherished. For the first time since my husband died, I was free to stop trying to earn love and acceptance that would never ever come. I had no idea then what I would discover in the morning, what I would learn about my daughter's true character, about my own hidden strength, and about the true exorbitant cost of unconditional family loyalty. But driving through the dark, silent streets with absolutely nowhere to go, I felt something stirring deep inside me that had been dormant for too long. My own voice, my own choices, my own life. And I was just beginning to understand how much of it I had carelessly given away. The motel room smelled strongly of industrial lemon disinfectant and stale tobacco smoke. I sat heavily on the edge of the stiff mattress, still wearing the navy blue velvet dress I had chosen for Christmas dinner, staring blankly at my outdated phone. It had been 22 hours since I had quietly walked out of Clara's house, and the ensuing silence was absolute and deafening. Not one phone call. Not one single text message. Not even from Thomas, the grandson who had whispered that small, genuine apology in the doorway. I had driven aimlessly for over 3 hours on Christmas night, stopping at every roadside park and pulling over onto every darkened shoulder, crying until my eyes were raw and burning, before finally pulling into a tired, cheap motel off Interstate 79. The desk clerk, a weary-looking woman about my age, had been kind enough to automatically apply the senior citizen discount without my having to ask. Small necessary mercies. Now, in the harsh, unflattering fluorescent light of the winter morning, the cold weight of reality was finally setting in. I had exactly $1,087 in my checking account. My next pension and Social Security payment wasn't due for 2 more weeks. I needed to find a safe, permanent place to live, and I needed to do it immediately. I picked up the silent phone and scrolled through my list of contacts. The list was far smaller than I had tragically realized. Most of our close friends had naturally drifted away after Arthur's sudden death, and the few who remained had been quietly absorbed into Clara's more affluent social circle. My sister, Diana, was obviously and completely off limits after her cowardly betrayal yesterday. My neighbor from the old apartment, Mrs. Ramirez, might have let me sleep on her sofa for a few nights, but Mrs. Ramirez was 85 and barely managing her own affairs. The phone remained utterly silent in my trembling hands. No one was rushing in to save me. No one was even taking the trouble to check if I was still breathing. I thought about Arthur then. Really thought about him for the first time in months without the constant distraction of Clara's manufactured family dramas. He had been my solid anchor for 34 years. That steady, unwavering presence that made everything else in the world feel manageable. When he died from that sudden massive heart attack at 59, I had genuinely felt like an entire half of myself had been violently ripped away. Clara had been astonishingly wonderful then. She had efficiently handled all the complicated funeral arrangements, she had helped me sort through his overwhelming belongings, and she had immediately insisted that I move in with them temporarily while I got back on my feet. For the first few months, it had honestly felt like we were closer than we had ever been. She had called every single day, brought the grandchildren over constantly for dinner, and made sure I wasn't completely drowning in my deep, paralyzing grief. When exactly had that changed? When had her genuine compassion curdled and turned into the bitter, poisonous resentment I had witnessed last night? I walked the few steps to the tiny bathroom and studied my reflection in the cheap, cracked mirror. At 70 years old, I looked far older than I should. The crushing stress of the past decade had carved deep, permanent lines around my eyes that no amount of cosmetic camouflage could conceal. My naturally auburn hair, once thick and shiny, had gone completely, harshly white. When had I stopped meticulously taking care of myself? When had I started only seeing myself through their cruel eyes? A burden, a heavy responsibility, a constant, unwanted reminder of everything they desperately did not want to become. My phone finally buzzed, vibrating noisily against the wooden bedside table. For a moment, my heart leaped with absurd, fragile hope. Perhaps Thomas. Perhaps even Clara, calling through a sudden wave of guilt to apologize, to say they had been monstrous, and could I please come home? It was a cold, impersonal text alert from my regional bank. Alert. Your account balance is below $100. Consider setting up account alerts to avoid overdraft fees. I stared at the chilling message, utterly confused. Yesterday morning, I had meticulously checked and confirmed that I had well over $1,000. I had made sure of it specifically so I could afford the modest Christmas presents and the motel room. I logged into my banking application, my hands shaking violently now as I navigated to my recent transaction history. And there it was. A large withdrawal dated yesterday, Christmas Day, at exactly 3:47 p.m. for $800, taken from an ATM I had never ever used in a location I had certainly never been. My stomach dropped with a sickening lurch. I called the bank immediately, navigating through the agonizing automated system with mounting desperate panic. "I am showing a withdrawal yesterday afternoon from your checking account," the customer service representative finally said, sounding bored, after I had verified my identity 3 separate times. "Did you authorize this specific transaction, ma'am?" "No," I managed to whisper, my voice barely functional. "I was at my daughter's house all day. I never made that withdrawal." "I see," the representative replied, utterly unconcerned. "Well, you will need to file a formal fraud report. However, I should mention that the withdrawal was made using your exact debit card and your validated PIN number, so the investigation process could potentially take several weeks to complete." Several weeks? I had barely $287 to my name and nowhere permanent to live, and it would take weeks to simply get my own stolen money back. "Can you please tell me which ATM machine it was?" I asked, though a horrible, chilling suspicion was already tightening its grip on my chest. "The Megamart on Riverbend Drive," she replied. 3 blocks directly from Mrs. Mitchell's address. The same Megamart where Clara frequently sent me to pick up last-minute groceries when she was preparing for a large family dinner. The same Megamart where she had been standing directly behind me just last week when I had used that exact ATM to withdraw money for my Christmas shopping. When she had stood right there, watching me carefully enter my 4-digit PIN, I slowly hung up the phone and sat back in the profound silence of that miserable, cheap motel room, the disjointed pieces of the puzzle clicking together in my mind like a horrible, perfectly aligned trap. The timing, the exact location, the calculated, vicious way she had orchestrated my humiliation and forced me out of the house. It was all premeditated. It had been planned. My own daughter had systematically stolen from me. And then, adding a final agonizing layer of insult to injury, she had made absolutely certain I was homeless, penniless, and utterly humiliated before I had even had the chance to discover the magnitude of the theft. I thought about all the countless times over the past few years when she had borrowed my debit card to pick up groceries or run essential errands. How many times had she memorized my PIN? How long had she been meticulously planning this precise move? I pulled out the bulky file folder I always kept with my most important papers and spread everything onto the quilted bedspread. Social Security statements, Medicare information, my former lease agreement for the apartment I could no longer afford. And there, tucked carefully behind my insurance cards, were documents I hadn't properly looked at in nearly a decade. The original deed to the sprawling, beautiful house where Clara now lived. I had forgotten. Or perhaps I had simply forced myself to forget, burying the truth under layers of grief and dependency. When Arthur died, the house had still been in both our names. I had willingly signed some confusing papers during those fog-shrouded, grief-stricken weeks, implicitly trusting Clara to handle all the complex legal details while I struggled simply to figure out how to exist without my life partner. I pulled out the deed with trembling, cold fingers. There it was, in crisp black and white: Elara M. Thompson and Clara Thompson Mitchell. Joint tenants with right of survivorship. Joint tenants. I still legally owned half of that house. The house I had just been brutally thrown out of like an unwanted piece of garbage. The house where they had contemptuously called me a freeloader. But there was still more paperwork behind the deed. Documents I truly did not remember signing, with official-looking letterheads and my signature clearly affixed at the bottom. I squinted desperately at the dense legal language, trying to make some sense of it. A quitclaim deed dated 2 years ago, transferring my half-interest in the property to Clara and Richard Mitchell for the nominal sum of $1 and other valuable consideration. I don't remember signing this. I whispered the words aloud into the empty room. I would never have signed this willingly, but there was my signature, neatly witnessed and properly notarized. My hands were shaking so violently now I could barely hold the brittle papers. Not only had Clara stolen my liquid savings yesterday, She had apparently systematically stolen my entire home, and all its equity 2 years ago. And I had been so trusting, so profoundly grateful to simply have a warm place to sleep, that I had never once bothered to question the documents or the quiet, pervasive guilt. How monumentally stupid could I have been? How completely blind? I thought back to every single family dinner where they had subtly, maliciously reminded me of their generosity. Every time Richard had made thinly veiled comments about the ever-rising property taxes and maintenance costs. Every crushing guilt trip about being a burden. All while they were living in a massive $400,000 asset that was still legally, morally half mine. The worst part wasn't the raw theft. It wasn't even the searing, ultimate betrayal. It was the staggering realization that my own daughter had looked me straight in the eye for months, perhaps years, knowing exactly what she had done. Watching me struggle to pay for my own tiny rent, watching me scrimp and save my few dollars, watching me feel intensely grateful for their occasional meager scraps of affection and hospitality. And she had felt absolutely nothing. No guilt. No remorse. Just cold annoyance that I wasn't sufficiently grateful for the luxury of living in my own stolen property. I picked up my silent phone and started to dial Clara's number, then slowly stopped. What exactly would I say? What possible words could I utter that would penetrate that immense, impenetrable wall of greed and selfishness she had so carefully constructed around herself? Instead, I opened my well-worn old laptop, the one gift Arthur had insisted on buying me before he died, saying I absolutely needed to stay connected to the modern world. I had barely used it except to play solitaire and check my email. But now I had a very clear purpose. I typed 2 crucial words into the search bar: Elder Financial Abuse Attorney. And I began making a precise, numbered list of phone numbers. If Clara Mitchell wanted me to permanently disappear from her life, she was about to get precisely what she had so viciously asked for. But not before I forcefully reminded her that some things, justice, consequences, and the raw, unvarnished truth, don't disappear simply because they happen to be inconvenient. For the first time since that terrible Christmas dinner, I smiled. It wasn't a particularly kind or gentle smile. It was a cold, hard, vengeful expression, but it felt remarkably good on my face. My daughter had made one monumental, crucial mistake in her carefully executed plan to get rid of me. She had wrongly assumed that I was as weak and pathetic as she had meticulously made me feel. She was about to learn otherwise. The law office smelled pleasantly of expensive leather, highly polished wood, and freshly brewed artisanal coffee. I sat across from Ms. Margaret Chun, a sharp-eyed, intensely focused attorney in her late 50s who specialized exclusively in complex elder abuse and financial fraud cases. I had found her name listed at the very top of every online search result, and her numerous reviews all mention one critical thing: she didn't lose cases. Mrs. Thompson, Margaret said, her voice clear and precise, as she meticulously reviewed the stack of confusing, heavy documents I had brought. I have to ask you this directly. Do you have any distinct memory of willingly signing this quitclaim deed? I slowly shook my head. I remember signing stacks of papers right after my husband died, but Clara insisted they were standard documents for insurance and Social Security purposes. I wasn't in a good place mentally. I blindly trusted her to handle everything to protect me. Margaret nodded, her expression remaining professionally grim. That scenario is, unfortunately, exceptionally common. Family members frequently take advantage of vulnerable seniors during acute periods of grief or dependency, when their judgment is severely compromised. She pulled out a small, professional magnifying glass and meticulously examined my signature on the deed. This signature certainly looks consistent with your other legal documents, Mrs. Thompson, but that in itself doesn't prove legality. If you were coerced, pressured, or actively misled about the actual purpose of what you were signing, it is still prosecutable as fraud. What about the cash she stole yesterday? I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The ATM withdrawal is much more straightforward. That is clear, documented theft, Margaret confirmed. With your direct testimony about her having access to your PIN, the precise timing right before she threw you out, and the immediate financial distress it caused you, we have an exceptionally strong case for grand larceny and felony elder abuse. Margaret leaned back deliberately in her plush, executive chair, her gaze unwavering. But Mrs. Thompson, I need you to fully understand the gravity of this situation. Fighting family, especially your own child, in court is tremendously expensive, financially draining, and emotionally brutal. Are you absolutely prepared for that war? I thought about the pitiful $287 in my checking account, about the cold, lonely anonymity of that cheap motel room, and about the 22 hours of absolute silence from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. What other viable choice do I have, Margaret? I asked, the answer already clear. Margaret's cool demeanor momentarily softened, and she offered me the first genuine smile I had seen since walking in. Then let's initiate some preliminary research. I want to pull every single public record on your property's transaction history. Often, when people become this brazenly greedy, they leave an undeniable paper trail. 2 intense hours later, Margaret's diligent assistant, a quiet young man named Kevin, had compiled a thick, unsettling file that made my stomach churn with nausea and cold fury. The fraudulent quitclaim deed was merely the beginning of the horror. Your daughter didn't just quietly steal your 50% interest in the house, Mrs. Thompson, Margaret explained calmly, carefully spreading documents across the massive glass conference table. 6 months after you signed over your interest, she and Richard immediately took out a substantial second mortgage for $200,000. Then, less than 5 months after that, they brazenly refinanced the entire property for a staggering $550,000. I stared blankly at the overwhelming numbers, desperately trying to process their meaning. But the house was only worth about $300,000 when Arthur and I paid it off. Property values in this zip code have increased dramatically, yes, Margaret clarified. But more fundamentally, they have been systematically using your house, your long-term family asset, as their own personal unrestricted ATM. Look at this. She pointed to a lengthy loan document, her polished nail tracing the line. They have pulled out well over $700,000 in easily accessible equity over the past 2 years. $700,000. From the very house Arthur and I had scrimped, saved, and sacrificed to buy. The house where we had raised our daughter, where he had lovingly taught her to ride her bicycle, steering her down the driveway. Where did all that money go? I asked, though a deep, horrifying suspicion was already forming. Margaret flipped expertly to another document, a corporate filing. Richard started a new consulting firm called Mitchell Legacy Solutions. According to these public corporate records, the firm received an initial $250,000 startup investment, listed as private family capital. Would you care to make an educated guess as to where that specific capital originated, Mrs. Thompson? My head was spinning violently. They had used my hard-earned home, my inheritance, to fund his narcissistic, ill-conceived business venture. It gets significantly worse, Margaret said, her voice dropping slightly, gentle yet absolutely relentless. The business failed spectacularly 6 months ago. They have already defaulted on 3 separate loan payments. Your family home, the very house they just threw you out of, is currently listed in the final stages of pre-foreclosure. The room seemed to tilt sickeningly. I tightly gripped the arms of my leather chair, fighting a sudden urge to vomit, trying desperately to process the chilling information. They are actively losing the house? They are 4 months delinquent on payments, Margaret confirmed. The bank has officially initiated full foreclosure proceedings. At the current accelerated rate, they will tragically lose the property within the next 4 months, unless they can immediately produce approximately $45,000 to bring the complex loans completely current. I sat in stunned, frozen silence. No wonder Clara had been so exceptionally vicious, so venomously desperate to get rid of me. It wasn't merely that I was an unwanted burden. I was a direct, living witness to their profound financial failure. A painful reminder of the massive asset they had systematically stolen and then spectacularly squandered. There is one last item, Margaret added quietly. I ran a comprehensive credit check on your daughter as an essential part of my standard research. She has filed for bankruptcy protection 3 separate times in the last 7 years. Crucially, on all 3 filings, she repeatedly listed you as a financial dependent, claiming she was supporting you fully. The terrible hits just kept landing, fast and brutal. She claimed I was entirely dependent on her. For tax purposes. Yes, Margaret confirmed. She has been deliberately claiming you as a financial dependent on her tax returns for years, while simultaneously extracting massive equity from your shared home. It is a calculated, systematic pattern of sustained financial abuse that dates back nearly a decade. I thought back to all those countless dinners where she had meticulously made me feel guilty for simply existing with them, for eating their food, for being such a massive burden, all while she was literally criminally profiting from my vulnerability, using me as an illegal tax write-off while actively stealing my property. Can we legally prove all of this? I finally asked. Margaret meticulously gathered the damning documents back into a neat, powerful pile. Mrs. Thompson, your daughter and son-in-law have carelessly left a paper trail a mile wide. Fraudulent deeds, multiple complex loan defaults, blatant tax fraud, severe elder abuse. She has committed multiple state and federal felonies. She paused, her professional gaze softening slightly. The critical question isn't whether we can definitively prove it. The only real question now is precisely what you, the victim, want to do about it. I stared out the window of the opulent law office, watching the normal people walk briskly by on the sidewalk below. Normal people with normal, everyday problems, not sitting in a lawyer's office discovering that their own child had systematically, cold-heartedly robbed them blind. What exactly are my available options? We can file immediate criminal charges for the grand theft and the fraud, Margaret outlined, holding up one hand. We can file a complex civil suit to nullify the quitclaim deed, since it was obtained through clear deception. We can legally force the immediate sale of the house and recover your full equity, plus documented damages. Or, Margaret paused again, carefully studying my expression, we can effectively use this massive volume of information as overwhelming leverage. What exactly do you mean by leverage? Your daughter is facing the catastrophic loss of her home through foreclosure. She desperately needs a massive influx of cash, and she now knows, thanks to my earlier subtle contact, that we know about her multiple crimes, Margaret explained. Sometimes, Mrs. Thompson, the credible threat of full public exposure is far more potent than actual prosecution. We could negotiate a structured settlement that not only recovers what she owes you, but also provides you with substantial punitive damages, all without dragging you through a lengthy, traumatic court battle. I thought about Clara's furious, contemptuous face on Christmas night, the cold, ugly satisfaction in her eyes as she publicly called me a freeloader, the meticulously calculated cruelty of stealing my last savings right before forcing me out the door. What kind of specific settlement? Margaret pulled out a crisp legal pad and began making rapid, precise notes. Well, let's calculate her debt to you. Your half interest in the house when you signed it over was conservatively valued at $125,000. The money she's documented as having stolen, including yesterday's ATM withdrawal, totals at least $18,000 over the last 2 years. Then we add the tax fraud, using you as a dependent while you were paying your own expenses. Conservatively, I would argue she owes you a minimum of $200,000 in documented damages. $200,000. More money than I had ever legitimately held in my entire life. Enough to buy my own small place, to live completely independently, to never again have to rely on the dangerous kindness of others. How quickly would it take to secure that kind of money if we sue? Could be 3 to 5 agonizing years, Margaret replied. If we negotiate. She smiled her sharp, professional smile. Could be 3 to 5 weeks. I made my final decision firm and absolute. I want to negotiate, but I have 2 non-negotiable conditions. And those are, Mrs. Thompson, I want her to know unequivocally that I know everything, I stated, my voice strong. I want her to understand the exact magnitude of what she stole and the profound cost of her betrayal. And I paused, letting the cold determination show fully on my face. I want her to have to look me straight in the eye when she is forced to sign the settlement and start paying me back. Margaret's smile grew wider, predatory and delighted. Mrs. Thompson, I think your daughter is about to receive a very thorough, very expensive education in the concept of consequences. Are you truly ready to be her teacher? For the first time in nearly 10 years, I felt a surge of genuine revitalizing power. Not the power that comes from wealth or manipulation, but the pure, unadulterated power that comes from the truth, from absolute justice, and from finally being able to forcefully stand up for myself. More than ready, I said. As I left the cool, hushed law office that late afternoon, I realized that Clara had made a critical, fundamental miscalculation. She had foolishly believed that humiliating me and robbing me would simply make me vanish quietly, that I would slink away like a wounded, easily forgotten animal and never pose a threat again. Instead, she had violently awakened something in me that had been deeply sleeping for far too long. Something that would absolutely not rest until she understood that actions always have consequences even when they are committed against your own loving mother. Especially when they are committed against your own mother. The war was now officially beginning. And for the first time in my life, I held all the necessary powerful weapons. I immediately moved into a small, clean, efficiency apartment near Margaret's office. It was modest, but it was profoundly mine. For the first time in 10 years, I belonged. Margaret confirmed we had compiled enough solid evidence to pursue criminal elder abuse charges against Clara. However, I wanted her to understand what she had lost. Your daughter called my office 3 separate times, Margaret informed me. She is clearly desperate, demanding to know what you are planning. She is scared. She should be, I agreed. Margaret revealed that Clara had less than 5 weeks to produce approximately $50,000 or the house Arthur and I had worked for, would be lost to pre-foreclosure. Margaret had already hinted at the possibility of inescapable prison sentences for elder abuse. I drove past the house that evening. Clara and Richard were clearly holding a frantic, high-stakes emergency meeting, trying to solve their catastrophic money problems. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with an anonymous text. Mom, this is Thomas. Can we please talk? I'm truly worried about you. My heart ached for my grandson, the good boy caught in the crossfire of his parents' spectacular financial crimes. Despite Margaret's warnings against direct contact, I arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe. The next afternoon, Thomas looked drawn and stressed. I am so incredibly sorry about what Mom said, he whispered. They won't tell me what's happening. Mom says having to support you drained their vital resources. I gently countered her lie, telling him his mother was struggling, because people sometimes look for someone else to blame for their own bad choices. He then asked the hardest question. Are you ever going to come back? Families are supposed to forgive each other, aren't they? I explained that my love for him and Olivia would never change, but that some fundamental things, once broken by betrayal, simply cannot be undone. I drove back home and immediately called Margaret. I want to initiate the final offer, I said. Now. But I need to deliver the offer in person. I want her to look me straight in the eye. Margaret agreed to draft the formal settlement. Full restitution of $200,000 over 6 years in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. 3 days later, Margaret called with the news. She wants to meet. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock sharp. She is bringing her own legal counsel. I spent the evening looking at old photo albums of Clara. I closed the album, knowing tomorrow wasn't about dwelling on the past. It was about defining the future. Clara Mitchell was about to learn a permanent, unforgettable lesson. Actions have profound consequences. The next morning, I dressed meticulously in my most formal attire. A dark charcoal gray suit, determined to project an image of undeniable dignity and unwavering legal certainty. I was no longer the woman who could be easily manipulated. As I walked into Margaret's towering office building, I knew what I had to do. Clara had stolen from me, abused me, and brutally discarded me. Now she would pay the inevitable price, and I would ensure she understood exactly why she had earned every penny of the restitution. The large conference room felt charged like a courtroom. Margaret sat calmly to my right with the overwhelming evidence. Across the table, Clara looked visibly smaller, her usual brittle confidence replaced by debilitating panic. Her attorney shuffled papers nervously. Richard was absent, a coward unwilling to face the consequences. Mrs. Mitchell, Margaret began coolly, my client, Mrs. Thompson, is prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement agreement that resolves this matter without public criminal prosecution. Clara's eyes darted between Margaret and me, searching desperately for the weak woman she used to know. She would not find her. Margaret smoothly slid the thick document across the table. Full restitution in the amount of $200,000 for the fraudulent transfer of property and the clear theft of funds, to be paid over a structured period of 6 years with compounding interest. In exchange, Mrs. Thompson agrees not to pursue imminent criminal charges for felony elder abuse, financial fraud, and grand larceny. Clara's face instantly went white. $200,000? That is utterly impossible. We simply do not have that kind of catastrophic money right now. You certainly had access to it when you systematically stole it from my client, Margaret replied calmly. I never stole anything. Clara's voice was now shrill, her composure gone. I took care of her for years. With my own money in my own house, I interjected, my voice flat and firm. Clara whirled to face me. Your house? You willingly signed it over. You gave it to us. Show her the comprehensive documents, Margaret, I instructed. Margaret opened the folder, spreading out stark copies of the quitclaim deed, the disastrous loan documents, and the original corporate filings for Richard's failed business. Your daughter obtained your signature through systematic fraud, Mrs. Thompson, Margaret articulated, directing her statement toward Clara's lawyer. She blatantly misrepresented the purpose of these documents, then immediately used the fully paid-off equity in your house as collateral for over $700,000 in reckless, high-interest loans. Clara's lawyer was frantically reading, his face grim. Clara, you did not disclose any of this loan history to me. Margaret presented the final, damning evidence. Furthermore, your daughter deliberately claimed Mrs. Thompson as a dependent on her federal tax returns for the past 5 consecutive years, receiving substantial tax benefits, while simultaneously charging her rent, utilities, and grocery fees to live in what was legally her own house. That, Mrs. Mitchell, is defined as tax fraud. The weight of the evidence crushed her. What happens to us if I don't sign this punitive settlement? She finally asked, her voice thin and defeated. Margaret's smile was glacial. Criminal charges. Felony elder abuse, financial fraud, grand theft. You are looking at the possibility of potentially decades in a federal penitentiary. Clara turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Mom, please. You know deep down I never actually meant to hurt you. I was just desperately trying to keep our entire family stable and together. By stealing from me? By throwing me out of my own home? By publicly calling me a freeloader? While you were actively living off my equity and tax evasion? I challenged. I was terrified, Mom. Richard's business was failing, and we were absolutely drowning in debt. I thought if I could just use the house equity to get us quickly back on our feet, I would pay you back every last cent. When? I asked, cutting through her sobs. When exactly were you planning to finally tell me what you had done? Or were you simply going to let me die believing I was a worthless burden for the rest of my life? She had no answer. She had planned to let me die believing the lie. Margaret intervened, stating that selling the pre-foreclosure house voluntarily was her only viable option to cover the initial payment and avoid bankruptcy. Sell the house. Clara's voice cracked. But that is my children's home. Where are Richard and I supposed to live? You should have given that exact question some serious, deep thought before you deliberately decided to steal, gamble, and squander it all away, I stated, the cruelty in my voice justified by her abuse. Clara's lawyer requested 24 hours to consider. As we left, Clara desperately grabbed my arm. Mom, wait. I love you. Doesn't that count for anything at all? I gently pulled my arm free. Love isn't merely something you say, Clara. It is something you do. And absolutely everything you have done to me for the past 2 years has demonstrated exactly how much, or how little, you truly love me. I walked toward the door. 24 hours, I repeated one last time without turning around. In the elevator I felt empty yet profound. This entire ordeal had never been exclusively about the money. It had always been about self-respect, about unequivocally refusing to be treated as disposable, about fiercely standing up for myself after 10 demoralizing years of abuse. I had already won conclusively. I was truly irrevocably free. The final decisive call came late that night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., precisely 12 hours and 13 minutes before Margaret's hard deadline was set to expire. Mom! Her voice sounded utterly ravaged, like she had been crying continuously for hours on end. I'll sign it. I will immediately sign the settlement. I sat upright in the quiet darkness of my small apartment, feeling an overwhelming strange sense of profound calm. All right. That's it. That's all you're going to say. What else is there left to say, Clara? You made your choices a very long time ago. Now you are simply living with the fully realized consequences. There was a long, desolate silence on the line. Then in a voice so faint, so small I barely recognized it as hers, she whispered, "I really am deeply sorry, Mom. I know you will never believe me, but I truly am. I believe you are sorry that you got decisively caught." "That's not dash," she started to protest weakly, then stopped herself completely. "Will you ever be able to fully forgive me?" I looked around my small, safe apartment, at the new quiet life I had fought to build from absolute nothing after she had so carelessly thrown me away. At the hard-won independence I had fiercely fought for, the dignity I had decisively reclaimed, and the genuine peace I had finally found in not having to constantly pretend I was wanted where I clearly was not. "I don't know, Clara," I said honestly, the words heavy and final. "But that is no longer your decision to make. It is mine." I hung up the phone and decisively turned it off. The formal settlement signing took place 3 days later, in the same conference room. Clara looked utterly exhausted, like she had aged 10 years in the time since our confrontation. She signed every single page without a single argument, her hand trembling slightly as she mechanically scrawled her name over and over again. The terms were professionally straightforward and unambiguous. She and Richard would immediately sell the house within the next 90 days and pay me an initial lump sum of $110,000 from the sale proceeds. The remaining $90,000 would be paid to me in 60 consecutive monthly installments of $1,500, each for 6 years. If she missed a single payment, the entire remaining balance would become legally due immediately, and I could then instantly pursue all initial criminal charges. The house is expected to sell for approximately $425,000 in the current market, Margaret explained as we reviewed the final signed papers. After paying off the high-interest mortgages, the substantial real estate fees, and the remaining legal debts, there should be just enough left to cover your crucial initial payment and leave them with a small, necessary amount to relocate. Clara's lawyer had successfully negotiated that small, necessary mercy, just enough money for a security deposit on a modest apartment somewhere far away. I hadn't objected. I wasn't seeking to utterly destroy her completely, merely to absolutely ensure that she could never, ever financially or emotionally hurt me again. As Margaret and I prepared to leave the lawyer's office for the final time, Clara caught up with me quickly in the long, silent hallway. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she pleaded, her voice choked with residual tears. "But Thomas and Olivia, they miss you terribly. They don't understand why you're not around anymore." I stopped walking instantly. "What exactly did you tell them, Clara?" "That we had a bad disagreement. About money. They don't know about all of this. I couldn't possibly explain it to them without fully admitting what I did." "So, you are still actively lying to your children?" "I am protecting them. They are just kids. They don't need to know their mother is a thief." I turned to face her fully, my expression cold and unyielding. "No, Clara. You are meticulously protecting yourself, just like you always have." Her face crumpled entirely. "What am I possibly supposed to tell them when we have to move? When all their friends ask them why we suddenly lost our beautiful house?" "The truth would be a perfect start," I replied simply. "But I know that is not, and never will be, your personal style." I walked away, leaving her standing there, but her desperate, final voice followed me down the long, empty hallway. "They truly love you, Mom. Whatever you think of me now, please don't punish them for my catastrophic mistakes." I didn't answer her, but her pleas stayed with me for days as I began to settle into my new life. 2 months later, I moved into my new permanent place. A small, beautiful, charming cottage on the far side of town. It had a lovely, sunny garden where I could finally grow vegetables, a quaint front porch complete with a comfortable swing, and most importantly, it was entirely mine. Completely, legally, undeniably mine. I was contentedly planting tomato seedlings in my backyard when I heard the creak of the front garden gate. I looked up and saw Thomas standing there, noticeably taller than I remembered, clutching a small, clumsily wrapped package in his hands. "Grandma!" I set down my gardening trowel and stood up slowly, brushing the rich, dark soil from my hands. "Thomas, how did you ever find me, sweetheart?" "I asked around," he said, looking incredibly nervous and uncertain. "Mrs. Ramirez, your neighbor from the old building, told me where you lived now. I hope it's okay that I came." "It is more than okay, Thomas. Come here immediately." He ran toward me then, and I hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of his shampoo, feeling how much he had visibly grown in just a few short months. "I brought you a very late birthday present," he said, pulling back slightly and offering me the package. "I know I missed your actual birthday in December, but I really wanted you to have something from me." Inside the paper was a simple, wooden-framed photo of the two of us from last Christmas morning, just before everything had completely fallen apart. We were sitting close together on the couch, and I was patiently showing him how to knit a scarf. Both of us were laughing genuinely at something, our heads bent together in easy concentration. "I found it on my old phone," he said quietly, looking at the photo. "I thought maybe you'd want a proper reminder that not every single thing about our family was awful or bad." I felt the sudden sting of tears prick my eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. This is absolutely perfect." We sat together on my porch swing, and Thomas happily told me about school, about the start of baseball season, and about Olivia finally getting her official driver's permit. Normal, mundane teenage things that felt incredibly precious because I had genuinely believed I would never hear them again. "Mom still says you're not talking to us anymore because of some terrible fight about money," he said eventually, the happy moment fading. I chose my words with exquisite care. "Your mother and I had some extremely serious disagreements about respect, honesty, and financial responsibility. Sometimes, Thomas, adults make profoundly bad choices that change their most important relationships permanently. But you will always be my grandma, right? Even if you and Mom can never work things out." I put my arm firmly around him, pulling him close to my side. "Always. That Thomas will never ever change. No matter what happens between your mother and me." "Good," he sighed, visibly relaxing against my side. "Because I was truly scared I had lost you forever, Grandma. You could never lose me, Thomas. Ever." He stayed for 2 easygoing hours, helping me cheerfully plant the rest of my garden and happily catching me up on everything I had missed. When it was finally time for him to go, he hugged me tight one last time. "Can I please come back?" he asked. "Maybe bring Olivia next time if she wants to come?" "Anytime, Thomas. This little cottage is your safe place now, both of yours." After he left, I sat alone on my porch as the sun slowly set, holding the framed photo he had gifted me. It was true. Not every single thing about our broken family had been bad. There had been love there, real, honest love, even if it had become profoundly twisted and poisoned by her immense greed and calculated manipulation. My phone buzzed with a short text from Margaret. "First payment received and cleared. $1,500 exactly on time." I smiled a genuine, peaceful smile, and immediately deleted the message. Clara was keeping up her end of the bargain, at least for now. The money was certainly necessary and welcome, but it wasn't truly about the money anymore. It was about the principle, about the ironclad certainty of consequences, and about firmly refusing to be permanently defined as a victim. 6 months after the settlement was formally signed, Olivia came to visit, too. She was hesitant and conspicuously shy at first, but she quickly warmed up when she realized I wasn't going to spend the visit lecturing her about her mother or attempting to turn her against her immediate family. We baked simple, delicious cookies together and talked openly about her college application plans, her recent summer job, and boys' normal, easygoing grandmother-granddaughter things I had sorely missed. "Mom seems profoundly sad all the time now," Olivia confided quietly as we cleaned up the flour-dusted kitchen. "She cries quietly when she thinks Thomas and I can't see her. The house is so much smaller now, and Dad is always angry." "I am genuinely sorry to hear that, sweetheart," I said, and I truly meant it. I had never wanted to utterly destroy Clara. I had simply acted to definitively protect myself from her ongoing malice. "Do you think you will ever be able to forgive her?" It was the exact loaded question Clara had tearfully asked me that dark night on the phone, and I still didn't have a simple, definitive answer. "Forgiveness is exceptionally complicated, honey," I explained, carefully choosing my words. "Sometimes people hurt us so profoundly, so deliberately, that even if we desperately want to forgive them, the critical foundation of trust is broken forever. And without complete trust, some relationships simply cannot ever truly work again." Olivia nodded thoughtfully, wiping her hands on a towel. "She still keeps asking about you constantly, Grandma, wanting to know if you're okay, if you're truly happy now. What do you tell her?" That you seem happier than I have seen you in a very, very long time. Is that bad? I hugged her close. No, sweetheart. That is honest. And total honesty is never, ever bad. A little over a year after the formal settlement was concluded, I received an unexpected visitor. Diana, my sister, stood awkwardly on my front doorstep, looking deeply embarrassed and tremendously uncertain. I know I honestly don't have any right to ask, she said immediately, her eyes cast downward. But, could we please talk, Alara? I made us both a calming cup of Earl Grey tea, and we sat together in my quiet living room, the unresolved tension between us thick and heavy. I owe you a deep apology, Diana finally whispered, her voice cracking. A massive, unforgivable one. I knew deep down something was horribly wrong that Christmas night, but I was a complete coward. I let Clara throw you out because it was easier and less inconvenient than actually standing up to her and demanding the truth. Why are you here now, Diana? Because Clara finally called me last week, hysterically crying. She told me the entire ugly truth, what she did about the house, the money, all of it. She said you decisively found out everything and forced her to legally pay it back. Diana shook her head, tears welling up. I had no idea the financial abuse was so profound and systematic. I genuinely thought it was just a typical family squabble over small amounts of cash. And now I know my own older sister was being financially abused and systematically robbed by her own daughter, and I stood by silently and let it happen. I am utterly ashamed of myself, Alara. I am profoundly sorry. It felt surprisingly good and immensely necessary to finally hear the apology, but it didn't magically erase the 10 years of deliberate, calculated harm. Thank you for saying that, Diana. Is there any chance we could we please try to slowly rebuild our relationship? She pleaded. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I truly miss you. I miss having my sister back in my life. I looked at Diana, remembering all the childhood years when we had been inseparable, when we had supported each other without question through our mother's long illness and the struggles of raising young families. One moment of terrible cowardice, I realized, didn't automatically erase a lifetime of sisterhood. We can certainly try, I said, offering a small, fragile smile. But things are profoundly different now. I am different now. She nodded quickly, genuine tears shining in her eyes. I understand completely. And Alara, I am incredibly proud of you for standing up for yourself. I know it couldn't have been easy or painless. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do, I admitted truthfully, but also the most necessary self-preserving action. That evening, as I carefully watered my burgeoning garden in the fading light, I thought deeply about the complex nature of forgiveness, the true meaning of family, and the profound, peaceful price of autonomy. I had painstakingly built a good, quiet life for myself, a peaceful existence, full of small, genuine pleasures and honest, reciprocal relationships. Thomas and Olivia visited me regularly. Diana and I were cautiously and slowly rebuilding our shattered connection. I had more than enough money now to live comfortably, a lovely home that was truly only mine, and most importantly, my absolute, hard-won self-respect. Clara continued to make her restitution payments on time, every month like clockwork. We had maintained no contact whatsoever since the settlement signing, and I was perfectly content to keep it that way indefinitely. Some bridges, once completely and utterly burned, simply cannot ever be rebuilt. And some relationships, once profoundly poisoned, simply cannot be healed or saved. But I was no longer angry. Anger was utterly exhausting, and I had tragically wasted too many precious years of my life on negative, consuming emotions. Instead, I felt something I had not genuinely experienced in a very long time. Contentment. I was free. Free from manipulation. Free from being constantly taken for granted. Free from the damaging pretense that being treated badly was somehow preferable to being alone. It turned out that being alone wasn't terrifying at all. It was deeply, beautifully peaceful. And for the very first time in my 71 years, I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years later, on my 73rd birthday, I received a small cream-colored card in the mail with absolutely no return address. Inside, in Clara's familiar, elegant handwriting, were just 4 words. I understand now. Sorry. I read the 4 words twice slowly, then placed the card flatly in my miscellaneous junk drawer, and went back to tending my beautiful, fragrant roses. Some apologies, I knew, simply arrived too late to matter or change the facts. Some complex relationships end not with theatrical, dramatic confrontations or grand, sweeping gestures, but with quiet, profound acceptance that some things simply cannot be fixed. And sometimes I realized that is exactly as it should be. I was no longer anyone's burden, anyone's obligation, or anyone's perpetual disappointment. I was simply Alara Thompson, living her life entirely on her own terms, fiercely independent and deeply fulfilled. And that, I concluded, was significantly more than enough. Now, I am deeply curious about you who took the time to listen to my complete story. What would you have done if you were placed in my exact position? Would you have sued for the money? Or would you have chosen to forgive and rebuild the relationship? Have you ever been through a systematic betrayal by someone you deeply loved? Comment below and share your thoughts. And meanwhile, I am leaving 2 other powerful stories that are channel favorites on the final screen. They will definitely surprise and move you. Thank you for watching until here.